Philadelphia is steep in broadcast history. From the early pioneering days of broadcasting in the 1920s to today, Philadelphia has always been at the forefront. The Delaware Valley has been home to some of the best local programming in the country, starting with the early soap operas and children's shows to pioneering the best news formats in the country. Much of it all began right here. From radio announcers to television personalities, cameramen to directors, these were the broadcasters that burned out the airwaves. These were the pioneers of Philadelphia broadcasting.
Hello, I'm Ed Cunningham for Pioneers of Philadelphia Broadcasting. And today I'm doing an interview in the home of organist extraordinaire Michael Stairs. And I have to say that this is the first time I have ever done an interview with anybody in their home in which an organ console is present in the right in the corner. Something absolutely amazing, and it certainly speaks to the music that Michael Stairs makes. Michael, good to have you with us.
Oh, thank you, Ed.
As a member of Broadcast Pioneers of Philadelphia. You've had a wonderful career in music, but one that also intersects somewhat with broadcasting and the web, which makes it seem like you're a perfect subject for our chat today. So let's get started. A very good place to start, of course. You're a native of Maine, I understand.
I am.
Now, I've been to the beautiful rocky coast of Maine. Anywhere near there, or more in the middle of the state?
I'm more in the middle. If you should drop a pin in the middle of the state, there is Little Milo, where a lot of the roads end. It's a little lumber town, but a great little place where three rivers intersect. And I was very glad to get some interest in music from the piano my grandparents had in their home.
So, as many instrumentalists, musicians are, you can play more than one instrument with precision, right?
Well, we try. Yes, indeed.
That's a good way of putting it, of course. We say you are an organist extraordinaire. Your father, I know, was a Baptist preacher, and tell us about how that element, I should think it's pretty obvious, but led you into your love for this king of instruments.
I always loved the sound of the organ. In Gardner, Maine, my dad had a church with a pipe organ in it. But in Presque Isle, Maine, the first church I was old enough to really remember, there was a Baldwin electronic, and I found out where the key was, and I used to sneak in after dark and play the thing. I just
couldn't do that on the sly very well. I'm sure it had to make some noise that was heard.
Well, I'm sure it did, but that didn't bother me. That was my real start. And
so did you just start playing around at the keyboard and essentially teaching yourself how this fantastic instrument works?
I did. It was hit or miss, and it turned out I was playing exactly backwards. So a lady in the summertime came up to Presque Isle who was quite the organist, and she set me straight and gave me a couple of weeks of lessons, so that I started to sound pretty fine. And by the time we moved to Erie, then I had some mastery of the organ.
That's right. So your father did some traveling with his preaching, especially in the summertime,
Yes.
You've told me. Is that when you wound up in Erie, or was that a little more permanent?
The move to Erie was following somebody else from the state of Maine. And my father had visited and loved the city, and it was a blessing for me because of the excellent piano training I got there. Wonderful.
Was this private teaching at the piano, or was this
Yes,
school?
my teacher was Frederick Cromus, who was originally from the Philadelphia area, retired to Erie, and then the people that steered me to the choir college were a husband and wife team at the Church of the Covenant in Erie. So I was blessed to be steered constantly in the right direction.
Now, it was at this point that you started saying to yourself, I presume as a young man, that the organ is the career for me, certainly as an instrumentalist, as a musician, this is what I want to do with my life?
Yes, and it was confirmed when I went to an organ recital by John Weaver up in Portland, Maine. I traveled a couple of hours to get to Portland, but when I heard John Weaver play a magnificent concert on that large Austin, I decided that's what I wanted to do.
And of course, at that point, your educational travels took you to two very, very prominent musical conservatories. Tell us about that.
The first was Westminster Choir College, where I was blessed to study with Dr. Mccurdy on the organ and Matilde McKinney on piano, and Warren Martin with composition. So it was a heaven for me. In addition, I became the student accompanist for the big symphonic choir, which was being prepared to sing in New York and Philadelphia and all over the place. But I got in that capacity to play for Bernstein, Stokowski, who was in his early 90s, Von Karajan. It was a wonderful opportunity, and that kind of fed into my love of the orchestra, and I've been very privileged to recently retire after 30 years with the Philadelphia Orchestra as a celeste player, a pianist, and mostly an organist.
Well, we'll certainly get into that part a little bit later because there's a wonderful instrument at the Kimmel Center that
Yes.
I know you know about. But let's get back. You mentioned Dr. Mccurdy, and for those of us who don't know, I know, of course, as the great Alexander Mccurdy.
That's right.
One of the great organists and teachers. And he taught, is that right, both at the Westminster Choir College and at the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia?
That's correct. And it was the 1 year that he had retired from Princeton that I went to full-time in piano, which was wonderful. But yes, I had 7 years with Dr. Mccurdy, and it was pretty tough, especially in the beginning years.
Now, what was so tough about it? It was stern taskmaster?
Oh, yes. You had to have things memorized for him. In fact, when you went into your lesson, you had to leave your music on his little stand. And you weren't allowed to take any kind of music to the console. And if you did poorly, then he'd threaten to give you a one-way ticket back to Maine.
Well, I know there were some tough teachers there. I've heard some stories about Fritz Reiner, the conductor, way before your time, certainly, how he would just throw instrumentalists out of the hall when they were rehearsing if he didn't like the way they played. So at a place like Curtis, it's got to be tough, I guess, to be that good. And one thing I should mention, too, by the way, before we go on, I always am glad to hear about experiences at the Curtis Institute, because at WHYY, where I had worked for many years in radio and TV before retiring, we've had and continue to have a wonderful working relationship with the Curtis Institute. We've done a couple of television broadcasts with them and many, many radio broadcasts, including some organ stuff. And as you know, I don't need to tell you, but I do want to make sure that folks know that's one of the greatest musical conservatories in the world.
Yes, it is. I was very blessed, and I think it's gotten better, if I dare say so. The collegiality between a tuba player and an organist, or a violinist and an organist, that really didn't exist that much in my day. And now this working together is a marvelous thing. We were pretty much in a cocoon back in the day. But
Well, we did our broadcast, our first radio broadcast back in the late 70s. And it was so interesting at that time. I don't want to turn this conversation to me, but it just brings back memories. We had to refurbish the broadcast booth at what was then Curtis Hall. It had not been used in 30 years or something like that. So we had to completely redo the broadcast booth at Curtis Hall so it would sound like something when we were broadcasting from there. So yes, I think there was one time a kind of a cocoon atmosphere, but it's opened up greatly ever since
Hasn't
that
it?
time.
Yes. And the dormitory idea, I was against it at first, but now the reports I get that to have a cafeteria and a dormitory, it's much more towards a regular college, which I think is healthy.
Well, it is. I've been there too, and it's a wonderful place. But enough about me and my experiences with Curtis. We're talking, by the way, with Michael Stairs, the great organist and broadcaster, at his home in Radnor. And I've been reminded to mention to folks that this wonderful, wonderful cottage, as I think you referred to
It is.
Michael, is just a glorious place to be in, and it has a little bit of history attached. Goes back for well over 100 years.
Yes, it was built in 1901 and was the first residence out here to have steel I-beams to hold the structure up. In fact, the second floor is larger than the first floor because of the I-beams going out and resting on these big pillars. And the home was the home of Pretty Polly Perkins. She was quite the beauty in her day, and the winter home was on Delancey Place. But the family came out here in the summer to take the summer air.
Was she a socialite?
Oh, very.
Oh, yes.
And she was quite in fashion. Her girdle was extremely tight, so that she was passing out quite often, but they always had smelling salts for Pretty Polly. And she'd have receiving hours here on Sunday afternoons up in the landing. And you were very blessed if she agreed to come out and meet a person on the landing.
Amazing. Well, it's a beautiful place you have here.
Oh, thank you.
Michael, it's just fabulous. And moving on to your professional career, and I think this is where this really dovetails with broadcasting and music. I mentioned, of course, our experience in doing some things with the Curtis Institute of Music, but you've had a lot of experience more recently on the web and certainly on the radio. Tell us about how that goes back and how it got started.
I started off in Erie with a most humble job. I played in the city mission for the church service that they had every Sunday night. It was a beautiful grand piano. It was the biggest piano. It had to be an 11-footer. But that was broadcast every Sunday night. And Saturday mornings, I did a radio show called Sky Pilots. And I was featured again at piano and organ. I think I was only 11. But that was a wonderful time. And I took a love to being on the air.
Well, it is certainly a mighty instrument, needless to say, Michael. Mozart referred to it as the king of instruments.
Yes, indeed.
And there's certainly, such a great visual element, I think, to the organ, with all of the activity you're doing, starting with your feet, and of course, obviously, the keyboard we know, but there's also the element of the stops and all of those extra added sounds that you can bring to bear, and the power of this instrument. It's in many ways almost like a symphony orchestra in a console itself. Tell us about the things that an organ can do with all of these elements that are on that keyboard there.
Well, my current broadcasting life is at Macy's on Wednesday nights, where I play on a web broadcast. It's called yesterdayyusa.com. And Wanamaker Organ loves to play music from the 30s and 40s, both classical and pops, which is very fun. But there, as well as here, you have an array of orchestral instruments. You have your brasses, and then your flutes, and a ton of oboes, and all sorts of exotic sounds. But it's like cooking. I mean, you have to mix this together in a pleasant manner.
And of course, in your work at the Wanamaker Organ, you work with Peter Richard Conte,
I do.
Whom we have had on the air ourselves, and he's certainly one of our great organists of the day, is he
Oh,
not?
he is. Yes, he is indeed. He knows how to make all of the special little gizmos work, where he can play the melody in his right foot and the bass in his left foot. I don't choose to get that fancy with it, but he certainly has been behind a renaissance of that wonderful instrument. Yesterday, I had visitors from all over the world, literally, greeting me after the concert. Such a thrill for Philadelphia to have that jewel.
It is a jewel. And now, is my memory that I'm taking a chance here, that it started its life at the St. Louis World's Fair in the early hundreds, and then, of course, when that closed, well, here was a wonderful instrument that had to find a home, and Mr. Wanamaker found one, right?
Oh, yes. The Wanamaker brothers were organ lovers. And this was the whole purpose. It still is to a degree. We love playing orchestral transcriptions because these symphonic organs were built to do exactly that. Not everyone could afford to go to even the highest balcony to hear the Philadelphia Orchestra, but the orchestra, in a sense, could come to the people. And that's the intent of Longwood Gardens and the Wanamaker Grand Court at Macy's and several other wonderful instruments we have in the city.
Yeah, and I want to get to the very latest one in a moment, but I do want to go back to where you're saying you've just retired after 30 years as a staff player with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and you kind of divided your time between, you say, several of the keyboard instruments. Is that right?
Oh yes, I started off playing a third piano. I was called in, and then I was called in next to do celeste, and I guess it wasn't very clear that I was mainly an organist until Muti came to town.
Ricardo Muti, who succeeded Eugene Ormandy, of course.
And Muti decided that I would be the official organist. So I've had a blast playing all sorts of keyboard things with the orchestra.
Now, of course, back in those days, that's when the orchestra was at the Academy of Music.
Yes.
They had an organ there. I don't remember a great deal about that organ, but I'm sure it was a pretty darn good. I can only assume it was a good one.
This one here in my house has a lot more horsepower.
Is that right?
Yes, it was greatly underpowered.
Underpowered,
that's the best word for it.
It was not, maybe not the perfect setting to install, because they installed one somewhat late in the Academy's life, sometime back in the 50s or 60s or something like that.
Well, they had quite a nice organ that was in there, installed by my teacher, Dr. Mccurdy, in conjunction with Aeolian Skinner. But unfortunately, the thing was on wheels, and anything with wheels goes over bumps, and a pipe organ going over bumps is not good. The holding the tune is woeful. So I played that for a long time, and one summer in August, it disappeared under cover of darkness. It's reemerged somewhere in the Doylestown area.
Did it roll out the door on the wheels, or what happened there?
It was very top secret. But they rolled in a Rogers organ, kind of similar to what I have here in the house, but that after time became an issue when I did a lot of playing at the Man. The organ got thrown into the van with the other instruments, and that really didn't set well. So we're very blessed now to have the Dobson pipe organ, and I have some wonderful friends that gave the console that you see up high in my honor, the Liam family. So now we started all over. When the pipe organ came in, people were immediately coming to me and saying, Michael, I never realized that the Pines of Rome had an organ part. And they said, oh, I didn't realize that the Holst Planets had a big organ part. And I think it was the people finally being able to hear the organ entrances that was so thrilling. Not to mention that with the ranks of low 32-foot pipes, people's chairs were moving. And that was something that had never happened with the electronic or the pipe organ before that in the Academy. So life is good.
Well, having experienced, even in your own home here, Michael, the floor is vibrating a little bit.
They have to
play that at that console. It is somehow part of the experience of listening to an organ live. Quite amazing.
Yes, it is.
I can imagine why you fell in love with it as a young boy. I have a wonderful story here that has been given to me by fellow broadcast pioneers of Philadelphia member Bill Kelly. About the time that the Eucharistic Congress took place back in 1976, and you were involved with that, and that's just my little way of setting this up. Why don't you tell the folks about that very special occasion in which you met a very special person?
Well, I concluded the Mass, we split the 1,000-voice choir into one choir of 500 and another choir of 500. So I was stationed at the Art Museum, and Mother Teresa was the principal guest. And she was being escorted very carefully by the police to stay with the motorcycles and the motorcades and all of this stuff. Well, Mother Teresa broke out of the line and ran over to me, grabbed my shoulder and said, "My son, you play beautifully." And the police were having fits, but I haven't washed this elbow since.
Well, needless to say, as we do this conversation in the summer of 2016, we know that not only was she a great humanitarian, but has since been canonized as a saint by the Roman Catholic Church. So, boy, talk about a brush with greatness.
Yes, I am indeed blessed.
You are indeed. Let me just bring up, have you had some, before we sign off, Michael Stairs, with the Fred J. Cooper Memorial Organ, which has been installed at Verizon Hall in recent years. An amazing instrument in itself. You said we were blessed in Philadelphia with several great organs. This certainly is the most recent example, right?
It is. Yes. The Cooper organ was designed specifically to blend in with the orchestra, and it does that amazingly well. When I come in with my trombones, I really blend with the actual trombone section. It's like we've added 10 more trombones to the existing section, and same with trumpets. It's got beautiful strings, which in some Strauss pieces blend beautifully with the string section of the orchestra. So it was very clever. The organ is a great concert instrument on its own, but I think its main forte is doing the organ work with the symphonies.
Well, the wonderful thing about that, of course, is that the inside of that beautiful hall, which is, as you know, kind of cello-shaped in the way they put it together, is that the pipes and so forth of that orchestra, of the organ, really lend themselves somehow to the design of that whole. Not only is it beautiful sounding in it, but it's a beautiful thing to see as well.
It is. And those aren't dummy pipes. Wanamaker has a lot of dummy pipes that you see. But these are actually speaking. Those big, tall silver things are actually very low pipes.
Well, let me ask you one final question about the technique of working with an orchestra at the console of an instrument like that. Anyone who's been in Verizon Hall knows that behind the orchestra there's that area where there's some more seating for the audience behind the orchestra, and then above that we have a console for the organ. Now it's got to be a little tricky when you're aiming one way and the instruments and the musicians of the orchestra are looking at the conductor the other way. Just how is it that you do those, what I'm sure are very important and intricate cues with a conductor?
Well, Eschenbach and Sawallisch and a number of them have come up to me and have asked, Michael, how is it that you're always exactly with me? The truth is that I have a wonderful TV camera up on the console. I can zero in on the maestro and have a much better view of him than anyone else in the orchestra. Others have a side view of the maestro. Some of them have a straight-on view but far back.
With other instrumentalists in the way.
Yes,
right.
yes.
All sawing away. You know?
Yes, and assorted woodwinds and whatnot.
Right.
But I actually have the best view because I can zoom in, zoom out, and get the picture just exactly right.
So that's the way it works. That's the secret.
It is the secret.
So now that you're retired from the orchestra, you keep busy. I know that you continue with your current church playing, right? Which is really where it all began.
Yes, and I'm also helping out at St. Charles Seminary. And the music program there had fallen into a little trouble. So my friend Rudy Lucenti and I are working hard to build up the choral program. I'm teaching musicianship and ear training, and I have private voice students. So life is quite full after retiring from the orchestra and 25 years at the Haverford School.
So, so as you learned back up there in Maine, so it goes on and you teach others, and your career continues very busily ever since.
It certainly does.
Well, Michael Stairs, a great pleasure to visit you in your home and to feature you today as one of our pioneers of Philadelphia broadcasting.
Thank you very much, Ed.
Well, as we promised you earlier on, Michael is not going to conclude this program just talking about the organ. He's going to show you what this instrument in his home can do with a little impromptu recital.
I'm very lucky to have a Hauptwerk system in my home here. It's the latest in technology. This actually is Salisbury Cathedral's organ. This is their console. And the sampling of the pipes is done at many times the normal revolutions. And they also sample the acoustic of the cathedral. So you'll notice quite a big difference between a normal digital setup and this wonderful Hauptwerk system.